Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO, and we're really pleased to have you here with us for Molly Picon as Lyricist with Ronald Robboy. This event is part of Carnegie Hall's season-long exploration of the many contributions that women have made to the world of music. We're really pleased to be a partner with Carnegie Hall on this. And before I introduce Ron and we head into our program, just a very brief word about YIVO. YIVO is a very special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have a library and archive with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which researchers around the world use. And you'll see some of those and hear some of those in today's lecture. And we do a variety of public programs like this and classes and exhibitions that bring the world of these collections and of Jewish history and Jewish culture to life. Musician, writer, and composer Ronald Robboy was the senior researcher for Michael Tilson Thomas's Tomaszewski project, for whom he developed the Yiddish theater musical reconstructions that Michael Tilson Thomas premiered at Carnegie's Zankel Hall in 2005. For many years, a cellist in both the San Diego Symphony and the San Diego Opera, Robboy was also active in the earliest years of the West Coast klezmer revival, and his own music has been heard in New York, California, and elsewhere. His writing on Yiddish film, literature, and theater music has appeared in academic journals and arts magazines. He has recently completed scholarly studies on Molly Picon and on Yiddish theater composer Abraham Elstein. Ron, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you all for joining us today. It's an honor to be here. This talk will not be a biography of Molly Picon or even just an account of her multifaceted career. What it will be is a close reading of her accomplishment as a song lyricist. It will be based on a considerably longer study I made that is currently being prepared for publication, which you may be interested in once you've heard about Picon's skill as a writer. Details will follow at the end of this talk, which I am meanwhile dedicating to a particular woman in music, Elaine Radoff-Barkin, known to many of her friends as Ray, was a distinctly creative composer. She passed away 2 weeks ago at the age of 90. She had also been the longtime co-editor of the journal Perspectives of New Music. And with her PhD from Brandeis University, she taught composition, theory, and then also Balinese music for many years at UCLA, as well as other institutions. A tough Bronx cookie who grew up in the amalgamated houses, the cooperative project pioneered in that borough. Elaine knew making music as a woman was her right, a right she exercised to the fullest. This talk is dedicated to dear Elaine. May her memory be a blessing. Molly Picon, who was born in 1898 and died in 1992, was not the only Yiddish theater personality to be born in America. But of those who were, she was the only one I can think of who reached unqualified stardom as of the kind achieved by idols of a decade or two or three before her. It was her name that appeared on marquees and that headlined theatrical ads in the Yiddish dailies in the same way that those of earlier stars had. Jacob P. Adler, for example, or Berta Kalisch, or David Kessler, or Regina Prager, or both Boris and Bessie Tomaszewski. Those names may not be remembered so well today, or let's face it, at all, by those who have little or no acquaintance with Yiddish culture and history. But Picon's career transcended her fame on the Yiddish stage. She went on to appear in English on Broadway and in London's West End, and where she may not have become the kind of superstar that she'd been to Yiddish audiences, she did have some starring roles, though. And from middle age until into her 80s, she also created numerous memorable character roles in feature films and television. And that was just as an actress. The stage musicals Picon had starred in also required that she be a singer and dancer As well as a comedienne, she had great verbal timing, but also excelled in physical comedy. None of that was a secret to her public. But unless one looked up in the corner of the sheet music editions that the Yiddish theaters would publish, this was merchandise sold in the lobby, the same way some lucky touring musicians today can sell CDs at their live shows. Unless one looked up in the corner, one, excuse me, one might not be aware that Picon had written the words to dozens of the songs she sang. She was, it turns out, an accomplished lyricist. Perhaps her most famous song is a gezunt, means as long as you have your health, which we will discuss in more depth shortly, but this is a taste of it.
A bissel Wind, a bissel Regen, a ruhig auf dem Kopf zu legen, a gezunt kann man glücklich sein. A Schich, a Sock, a Kleid und Lasses und Käschen, a 3, 4 Slosses, a gezunt kann man glücklich sein. Die Luft ist frei.
And another is the autumnal song Mazel. It means fortune. A song that indelibly, even today, remains in the Yiddish repertoire. It was conceived as a love song, but was also adopted by doomed European Jews.
Mazel, du scheinst einmal für jeden und nicht für mir. Mazel, du bringst da jeden Frieden, für was versäumst du mein Tier? Ach, wie es tut bange jeder schon, das Leben vergeht und keine Hoffnung ist als nicht da.
The music to both those songs was by Abraham Elstein, who composed them for the 1938 film Mamele. Before going on, I should acknowledge that as we proceed, some of you may notice that Picon's pronunciation, and I'm thinking mostly of her vowels, will not always quite match the transcriptions you will see here in the slides. That's because of the several dialects of Yiddish, there was one that, by convention, was used on the Yiddish stage, but it does not always match the standard adopted by the YIVO Institute and by Yiddish scholarship in general. It is the YIVO standard that we will be seeing here, with the exception of when Picon's pronunciation is essential to a rhyme she has created. In the 1920s, Picon collaborated with composer Joseph Rumshinsky, who was nearly 20 years her senior and often called the dean of Yiddish theater composers. Most of the many songs they wrote together are rarely heard today. This is a clip from Was soll ich tun, als ich hab ihn lieb? What can I do if I love him so? Which begins with shifting points of view from an omniscient third-person narrator to the singer's father, back to the narrator, and then to the singer herself, who tells us she's been abused.
Der Tate schreit, oi mein Kind, der Mann ist nicht von dir, ist ein Scharlatan. Die Mama weint und sie bett, und das Mädel singt Gott sei Dank. Wo soll ich hin, als ich hab ihn lieb? Ist mein Glück, ist mein Welt. Wo soll ich hin, als ich hab ihn lieb? Und ihm ist mir. Ist doch meine Welt, hat lacht in macht mit meiner Liebe
Before I go on, I notice on my screen, and many of you who may not be terribly experienced with Zoom, if the little window that I'm in and that the YIVO logo is in is obscuring, for example, some of the translations that are on the screen, you can slide that window around with your cursor. I shouldn't be trying to give people advice. I'm of a generation that has not grown up as a native speaker of computer, but there you go. That's my advice for you. Okay, the team of Picon and Abe Elstein, who began their collaboration in the 1930s, produced not only songs for operettas and films, but also a series of novelty songs. Written in the 30s, though they were not recorded until right after the Second World War, in which Picon wrote freely both in Yiddish and in English. This, for example, is a short clip from Az Mashiach Vet Kimen Kein New York, recorded in 1947 as Messiah in New York.
As Mashiach zet kimmen ze geen niet op affaires, maar op een aeroplane, met a jeder Jid in een automobiel, in begegnen op LaGuardia Field. Mashiach zet zitten in een offene car, op Broadway touren via Hollywood star, from City Hall dat de Mailsteen, in begrüßen Mashiach ganz schön. In der Nuchtem wird seiner Banket, a dog shall molesten, don't you bet. It's Miss that Himmel absolutely free. So then America singen that sea. I've an aeroplane that they're fleeing.
This is from another, recorded as Busy Busy, but originally titled Heaven Help the Viking Goyle, as we can see in a detail from Picon's own typescript, which, along with Messiah in New York and some other of these novelty songs, is held in the archives of the YIVO Institute. As Picon boasts in her memoir, she never had a secretary and she always did all her own typing. Note that for this song, she credited herself as the composer as well as lyricist, though Elstein did make its arrangement and ran its recording session. We will only hear a bit of it, but Picon's text, which falls somewhere between documentary and stream of consciousness, is marvelous for the way it slips between interior monologue and then, without warning, dialogue, or I should say one half of dialogue, where we only hear the Viking Goyle's half, as though we were eavesdropping on her half of a telephone conversation. All of this owing to Picon's performance. For on the printed page, she often dispensed with punctuation altogether, so it looks more like the kind of high modernism you might expect from, say, a Gertrude Stein. You might also notice that in the recording, Picon substituted a few Yiddish words here and there for the English that we see in her typescript, and that Yiddish constitutes a literal instance of code switching, for it is only when speaking to her girlfriend Tilly that Picon's Viking Goyle inserts the Yiddish substitutions.
Busy, 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 all day long I'm in a whirl. Busy, busy, I am dizzy. Heaven help the Viking Goyle. Every morn I rise at dawn, take a shower, brush my hair, rush into my clothes like mad and run downstairs. Good morning there. Grab a cup of coffee quick, kiss my ma goodbye and then these my hat and these my coat. Quick or I'll be late again. In the subway how they stiff you, gee, but men sure have big feet. I think the shock would kill me if a man gave me a seat. There's my girlfriend, smocks to Tilly. Jay, you're looking swell, my dear. Did that Pasquignac call you? No, I'm getting off right here.
Molly Picon, as I said, was born in America, and English was actually her native tongue. That said, she was no stranger to Yiddish, speaking some at home with her immigrant parents and grandparents, as well as on stage as a child actor, and then in both English and Yiddish in regional theater as she grew up. That was her background when she met an actor and writer named Jacob Kalisch, who became not only her husband, but as she candidly explained in her late in life memoir written after Kalisch had died, it was he who planned and managed her career. Her career, in other words, became the subject of his. Very soon after their marriage, they went to Europe for nearly 3 years so that, in Kalisch's view, she could perfect her Yiddish. He had been born in Galicia, at the eastern edge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he was a native Yiddish speaker. Hers was not a pure Yiddish, and she had an American accent. The plan was that there in Eastern Europe, where she would garner accolades and build a reputation, she would not only build her resume, but her confidence and credibility as well, so that if all went according to plan, upon her return to New York at the end of 1923, she could, as a star attraction, break into Second Avenue, where by then the A-list theaters there on Manhattan's Lower East Side had become the epicenter of Yiddish theater internationally. Miraculously, but owing, of course, to her immense talents, it did. It went according to plan. The diminutive and energetic actress's first appearance was in Yankele. In it, she played the title role, that of a 13-year-old boy, and she was a smash success in this first of what became, through the remainder of the 1920s, an uninterrupted string of box office triumphs. All were to the music of Rumshinsky, whose rise through the 1910s had culminated in his emergence as Second Avenue's leading composer. And all these Picon-Rumshinsky hits were under the direction and scrutiny of Kalisch. The three quickly became business partners, and 2 years later actually took over management of the Kessler Second Avenue Theater itself, one of the busiest and most important houses on the avenue. This was, as I said, through the 1920s, the so-called jazz age in America. And Yiddish theater songs were progressively evolving structurally, stylistically, and not least in terms of vocal delivery in the direction of Tin Pan Alley songs. That commercial popular song was itself shaped above all by the impact of African diasporic musical cultures. In other words, the music of the descendants of enslaved Black Americans. The American popular song, from Irving Berlin and George Gershwin all the way through rock and roll and beyond, is epitomized by its standard 32-bar chorus, which contains what pop musicians call the song's hook, the memorable and repeatable moment that becomes a song's identity for a listener, even if that listener cannot remember exactly how any other part of the song went. The structure of the 32-bar chorus, which will be helpful to know as we talk about Picon's writing, is simple, and it goes like this. It opens with 8 bars that usually contain the hook. The same 8 bars of melody are then repeated. The words may or may not change, but the melody is repeated. And that's the first 16 bars. Following that are 8 new bars called the bridge, with new and contrasting melodic and harmonic material. And then the original 8 bars return. That's 4 times 8, right? Equals 32 bars. Preceding each iteration of such a standard chorus, there is usually a verse, which is usually in a style closer to spoken word and often outlines a setting or tells a story of some kind. Rumshinsky was no exception to this trend of assimilation. He had begun by structuring his music on the model of European operetta. But by the mid-20s, his songs may have sounded Jewish. I wish we had time to define what that means. But compositionally, they had already migrated to the Tin Pan Alley model, and he was writing 32-bar choruses with words by Picon. In the 1927-28 season, with many successes under their belts, they produced an operetta called Bissaleh. That's the name of Molly's character in it, in which the song Es fällt die Rosinke was featured. Figuratively speaking, the song title means she's missing that thing. Listen to its chorus.
Es fehlt dir die Roschinke, es fehlt dir die Roschinke, es fehlt dir der jiddische Mier. Oh, es fehlt dir die Roschinke, es fehlt dir die Roschinke, und dem ist da jeder einer begehr. Sie hat schöne Hure, sie hat zwei Augen wie zwei schwarze Riechen, sie hat a Figur an Netzen, sie hat a größen Iris. Na, die Roschinke, es fehlt dir die Roschinke, es fehlt dir der jiddische Mier.
Okay, firstly, of course, there is that word rozhinke, the thing that she's missing, with its delicious voiced fricative zh that tickles all the way down to the nasal like in vision or precision. Literally, of course, rozhinke means raisin. As many of us know, if from nowhere else, then from the lullaby Rozhinkes mit Mandlin, Raisins and Almonds. It's from Avram Goldfaden's 1880 operetta Shulamis, and it quickly became folklorized and remains among the most iconic of Yiddish songs. Whether intended or not, it would be hard to deny that Picon's appropriation of the word engages Goldfaden's lullaby in an ironic way, if for no other reason than for its sheer boisterousness. But it should be evident that in Picon's lyric, not only does rozhinke not really mean raisin, but having that rozhinke means having that undefined something, that elusive je ne sais quoi that everyone recognizes but is unable to say exactly what it is. I've been told by people more knowledgeable than I about such things that the use of rozhinke in this way seems like it must antedate Picon's lyric. But I've not been shown or been able to find any documentation or other actual evidence of such use. If Picon coined it herself, it was brilliant. But even if it was a common idiom and entirely unoriginal, it was still great songwriting. The it that Picon was singing about, in other words, was the it, namely allure. It was the very quality moviegoers saw in the character played by actress Clara Bow in the film entitled It, a tremendous box office success that conclusively established Hollywood stardom for Clara Bow, the plucky, diminutive, high-energy actress. Those are words, of course, that, not coincidentally, could be describing Molly Picon. The film It had been released in February of 1927. Bissaleh opened the following September on the day after Rosh Hashanah. By the time Bissaleh opened, Clara Bow had become a media sensation for her role in It, and she was known as the It Girl. Picon's lyrics certainly sought to capitalize on the notoriety that Bow's It had generated. It did so not only by mimicking the coy ambiguity and lack of definition of the word it, but also by turning its very concision on its head, ironically piling one syllable upon another in a parade of succulent, complex consonants, rozhinke, and Picon does floridly roll that R each time in her recording. This is the chorus's opening 4 bars with the song's hook. After the first line, with the repetitions of the rozhinke, comes line 2. It ends with nye, which has no lexical meaning whatever, but is entirely an expressive sound. And the expressivity is made culturally specific. It's that Yiddish nye. Think of a shrug and a cannot be bothered dismissal of some mediocrity. Nye. And then nye rhymes with the nonsensical bleh, which is equally devoid of meaning, except that it's probably even more meaningful. Okay, following, oops, pardon me, page turn. I'm reading here, of course. Following those first 4 lines, which spread across 16 bars, comes a second quatrain, a quatrain being 4 lines of poetry, of course, and they are set to the chorus's bridge, and thus are condensed into only 8 bars. They represent a marked contrast to the first quatrain, both musically and textually. The words to the first, with the hooks, rollicking syncopations, may be nonsensical, but they're stable. They remain the same, with no changes in every statement of the chorus as it follows each successive verse. But the words of the chorus's second quatrain, which comprise the bridge, completely change with each new iteration of the chorus. What is more, they provide a sort of comprehensible narrative in a kind of patter, all of which is over music that, while still jaunty, is more contained. In Picon's recording of the song, she doesn't even exactly sing these 4 lines, though, but she does more of a declamation. Well, really, she shouts over the melody. This kind of patter is very much in the tradition of the couplet. Coupletten were the witty trifles that were standard in Yiddish theater ever since Goldfaden had imported the bantering multi-stanza couplet from French light opera. In the context here of Es Felter die Rosinke, for convenience, we'll call those changeable 4 lines a couplet, but only as a simple abbreviation. Ordinarily, the term refers to an entire song. Okay, following her inserted couplet, Picon's chorus always returns to a concluding reprise of the material of its first 2 lines. Oi die Rosinke, es felter die Rosinke, es felter der Yiddischer Mnie. On Picon's recording, being limited to 3 minutes by the technology of early 78 RPM discs, she only sings a couple of choruses. But the sheet music that the theater published is a different story. The song is much longer, offering different coupletten that Picon could, and evidently did, drop into choruses when she performed in the show, so that no 2 versions of the song were exactly alike. And she labeled some of those jokey quatrains catch coupletten. The back of the back has the complete lyrics. Let's see. I'm going to look for. I can't find it here on my screen. I'm going to activate the laser pointer. On Picon's recording, limited. The back has the complete lyrics, and it has the cast in English and Yiddish. These are the complete lyrics here, and these are the something she calls catch coupletten. In this detail, you can see the catch coupletten. Each is wittier than the next. They deal with celebrities, politicians, religious figures, and others, from Clara Bow, the sultry silent star Pola Negri, and celebrity cantorial soloist Yossela Rosenblatt, to Charlie Chaplin and prize fighter Jack Dempsey, to violinists Misha Elman and Yasha Heifetz, to New York City Mayor Jimmy Walker and anti-Semitic industrialist Henry Ford. This one here is about Adam and Eve. The Yiddish is Chava hat das nit gehat und Odem pflegt sie ständig kischen, weil Chava hat doch dann nit gehat kein competition. The English is Eve did not have it, and Adam used to always kiss her anyway. That's because at that time Eve still didn't have any competition. So that was her catch coupletten that she dropped. That was one of them that she dropped in. On her recording of the song, after 2 complete stanzas of a verse and chorus each, she sings yet another chorus in a one more time style, supported by rowdy brass and a bring down the house accompaniment. And this time she injects one of the catch coupletten.
Die Rosinke, erzählt viel, die Rosinke, erzählt viel der jiddischen Jagd. Erzählt viel, die Rosinke, oi, die Rosinke, erzählt viel der jiddischen Jagd. Erzählt viel, die Rosinke, und die Rosinke, erzählt viel bei jeder ein am Jagd. Das hat Charlie Chaplin, Jack Dempsey hat uns in sein Wachsen, ich hat es neulich.
My inference is that these catch coupletten, as she called them, were created for exactly this kind of use, dropping into extemporaneous repetitions of the chorus. after all the verses were sung, as pre-packaged couplet units in order to extend the song, to extend it for her cheering audiences or as an encore. This song was undoubtedly a big hit in Resela, and it is easy to imagine Picon being called back to sing it again and again by her adoring fans. Of the 6 printed catch coupletten in the sheet music, it will come as no surprise that the first leads off with Clarabeau. Clarabeau has it, and Polinegri has it by the quart. Jossela Rosenblatt has it, only it's under his beard. The catch coupletten are not always about sex appeal per se, as we can see, because Clarabeau, Polinegri, and Cantor Rosenblatt's beard do not all share the same allure. Other of these coupletten, meanwhile, veer off into absurdist exploitation of the undefined meaning of Roshinke. Jimmy Walker has it, and so people are satisfied with him. And Henry Ford, the poor thing, is now looking for it among the Jews. Jimmy Walker was the stylish and still popular mayor of New York City at that time. He'd only been elected the year before. Having been himself a songwriter earlier in his career, he was a habitué of Manhattan nightclubs and was known as quite the man about town. He was later deposed in a corruption scandal, but at the time Picon wrote her lyric, he was still flying high. As for Henry Ford, you need to understand that, as it happened, only 2 months before Resela opened, Ford had issued a dramatic apology to the Jewish people for the viciously anti-Semitic claims he'd espoused over some years in the Dearborn Independent, the weekly newspaper he had acquired in order to peddle his malevolent and white supremacist political views. But his unexpected contrition was widely covered in the Yiddish press, and Picon had, obviously on the fly, made up some of her catch coupletten about it. Now to the verses of Es Felter die Roshinke, which are conventionally straightforward. And listening to them, we realize that this song is overall itself a classic strophic couplet. The words to the humorous narrative pattern change from verse to verse, while the normally fixed chorus intervenes between each. Parenthesis, that Picon's chorus itself had embedded within it a constantly but indeterminately changing mini couplet. Remember, that was my abbreviation for those 4-line punchlines she dropped in each time. That only demonstrates that she had achieved a mastery that allowed her to transparently play with formal concerns. Okay, this is the first verse.
Ich kenn a Mädel, die schöne Nädel, trug net a Kleidl, nor etwas fehlt ihr. Sie geht auf Teller, kriegt bald a Feller, da seid schneller, als etwas fehlt ihr. Gebildet ist sie sehr, in sie spielt Klavier, sie hat a gebackte Nuss, in a Tassen a Gewirr. Sie hat Manieren, kein kokettieren, doch kein Sach lässt nicht helfen ihr, weil es fehlt dir die Roshinke, es fehlt dir.
And finally, this is from the final stanza, right before that brassy turn to the catch coupletten. It's about an actress who mugs and hams and overacts, trying to gain an audience's attention.
Sie schreit, ich bin a Star, ich hab Talent wie no Duse. No, der Eulen fragt, wie nimmt a Frau a so viel Huse? Oi, die Roshinke, erzählt dir, die Roshinke, erzählt dir, der Jiddisch am
For those unfamiliar with her name today, Eleonora Duse, who lived from 1858 to 1924, was an Italian-born dramatic actress. She was considered by many to be the greatest of her generation, or even, and maybe this is a bit hyperbolic, the greatest of all time. But that's the point here. The ham is comparing herself to the greatest. Duza, whose name Picon plainly expected her audiences to recognize, was a leading exponent of playwright Henrik Ibsen's naturalism. She wore no makeup and was known for disappearing into her characters as she plumbed their great psychological depth. Duza, it's safe to say, must have had that Rozhinka, just as Picon did. Let's turn back now to the 1923-24 season. That's 4 years, season prior. Picon's first on Second Avenue. The success of her debut as 13-year-old Yankele was unmistakable. But in that debut's wake, she was not only closely identified with a child's role, but with a male impersonating child's role. Her next appearance was to be in Tsipke, in which she was to play a young woman named Tsipke, not a boy, and for that matter, not a girl, but a woman coming into maturity. The show's backers were nervous about her being able to act the part of a grown-up convincingly, to say nothing of a grown-up who's female. Rumshinsky, who was writing the show's music, had his concerns too, but they were soon put to rest. Picon rose to the occasion with flying colors. What's more, she wrote the lyrics to many or all of the songs in the show. I'll interject here that I'm afraid establishing exactly how many songs she wrote in this show or any others will require actually considerably more research. But included in the score for Tsipke was the song A Bissel Liebe und a Bissel Glück, bit of love and a little bit of luck. As Rumshinsky noted in his memoirs, this was the first love song he had written for Molly Picon to sing. And indeed, it appears to be the first love song for which she wrote the lyrics. Taken together, the music and its lyric merit a close listening and a close reading. For me, the genius of this song, which structurally is still more European in conception, actually, though the sound of Tin Pan Alley has begun to stir in the background, the genius lies in the opening line of its refrain. Abyssal becomes abissale. That is, a bit becomes a little bit. Rumshinsky's melody puts a quick syncopation in bissaleh, so that it becomes the focus of the entire phrase. And that phrase, with its cute rhythmic distinction between bissel and bissaleh, becomes the song's hook. Part of what makes bissaleh so poignant is its irony. It's not asking for much, only that everything works out and that the singer has love and happiness. Not much, huh? The second line ends with ein Augenblick, an instant, which of course rhymes with a bissel Glück. But it is more than the words that rhyme. Rumshinsky's second phrase, corresponding to line 2 of the lyrics, creates a musical rhyme by repeating line 1's melodic phrase, along with its catchy syncopation, but terracing it up a step, all of which mirrors the rhyme in the lyric and effectively extends the hook to double its length.
bissaleh glick. Die sind so scheinen, nur auf ein Augenblick.
Then, of course, lines 5 and 6 repeat the same formula. So the terraced repetition is itself repeated, but with the alteration in harmony that sets up the way melody 7 is so different from how it had been in line 3, if that makes any sense. Okay. And lastly, line 8 rhymes kein Sach nicht, not one thing, with line 4's ein Minute, meaning 1 minute, creating an overall arch form in the chorus with a rhyme scheme that ties the whole thing together. Now, look at lines 3 and 7. Neither one appears to rhyme with anything, that is, not with an end rhyme, at the end of the line. But look at how rich they are in internal rhyme. In line 3, in the phrase mein Hartrein, which means into my heart, the internal rhyme of mein and rein is magnified by the internal rhyme that Hartrein creates with Sonnenschein in line 4. And then there's assonance, a kind of cousin to alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of initial consonants, right? The fickle finger of fate, right? But assonance is the recurrence of a vowel sound. Let's make one up. Classic fascist pageantry. The way things are going these days, that could be a useful phrase to have at hand, I should say. Anyway, at the end of line 7, the assonance in jeden gegeben, meaning gave everyone, is echoed by an internal rhyme with the following line's phrase, Glück und Frieden, good fortune and joy. All this repetition and rhyme, both internal and at the end of lines, are complemented by Rumshinsky's musical solutions for lending not only unity and coherence, but also complexity. The melody shrewdly amplifies the internal rhyme of Hartrein and bringen Sonnenschein by creating fault lines that inject ambiguity about the musical phrase lengths. On the final syllable of the phrase in mein Hartrein, the melody plunges nearly an octave. The interval is a minor seventh, actually, which is markedly expressive in this context. But it plunges to a low note to dwell on the syllable rein. Then the same melodic formula is repeated on the last syllable of the phrase, bringen Sonnenschein. So the same low pitch dwells on shine after the same leap down. The effect is to create two short intermediate rhyming lines of text that are isolated from the larger lines to which each belongs. Their phonetic and musical rhymes are emphasized by that isolation. You see what I mean there? The melody for lines 7 and 8 also creates musical rhymes to support the internal rhymes of the lyrics. The musical fault lines and phrase length disruptions here are more subtle here than in the first half of the refrain, but equally effective. And then one finds oneself caught very much off guard at the end of the last line as its concluding phrase, Und mir kein Sach nicht, and for me not one thing, that means, stands abruptly isolated when the melody there recalls the earlier formula with the plunging interval. This time, though, the plunge is a full octave, so that the word kein, meaning not one, dwells on the lowest pitch in the refrain, a note that appears only this once as a literal low point for the despondent singer. Overall, the range in bissaleh and bissaleh, that is the distance from its lowest to its highest note, was wide compared to the majority of Yiddish theater songs, which speaks to Picon's ability and to the confidence Rumshinsky placed in his new singer. Now, note how the word kein is transcribed here, with the diphthong pronounced like the English word I, kein, not as Cain, which would be somewhat more a somewhat more common pronunciation. This is because on Picon's recording, that is not merely the way she pronounces it, but more importantly, it is the way she sings it. There is a musical and acoustical reason for it, along with the poetical one. On other songs Picon recorded, she usually sings Cain, but even more often, when it is on a musical passing note of short duration, she sings Ken, like Ken in Hora, for example, Ken being the no of may there be no evil eye. My impression, though I have not systematically investigated this, is that whenever she sings kein, she wishes to give it some emphasis. It is particularly emphatic here in bissaleh und bissaleh, where it falls on that sustained lowest pitch. Changing the vowel allows the throat to open. Say ah, says the doctor, not eh. And it shifts its resonance deeper into her chest instead of remaining in her head as it would have with Cain. Thus, it reinforces the meaning of the lyric, not just by having its sound echo the metaphorical depths of her character's unhappiness, but by having the singer's very anatomy reenact that descent. Picon's vowel choice here offers a quintessential example of how music and lyric interact synergistically, creating a poetry whose full implications require an intoned realization. That synergy, of course, is the elusive desideratum. As Picon would explain in an interview she gave in her late 70s, for songs with Abe Elstein, she usually wrote the words first, which Elstein would then work from. We do not know the modus operandi that the prolific Picon-Rumshinsky collaboration settled into, but we do know that for the hook to A Bissaleh und a Bissaleh, which came at the beginning of that collaboration, Rumshinsky actually recycled music from an earlier song of his titled In a klein Stibele, in a small cottage, that had appeared on 2nd Avenue 2 years before. For all practical purposes, the music for those 8 bars, and only those 8 bars, I should emphasize, that music, that is the hook, is exactly the same, including the signature syncopation. Da 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 dee dee, da 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 dum. That's the hook. We cannot know with absolute certainty, but it seems likely that he fashioned a new tune using the hook from the older one, and then presented it to Picon as a sort of fait accompli. That is, she would have to fit words to Rumshinsky's tune instead of the other way around. In my imagination, I picture the jazzy syncopation in the 3rd bar inspiring the word bissaleh for her, and everything else followed from that, but who knows? The lyrics and melody of the entire refrain are so carefully and so interestingly integrated that one cannot help but wonder how else it might have unfolded. One thing is certain, though. For a first outing, this is a very impressive lyric for a very good love song. The Picon-Rumshinsky team broke up then in 1931, though the two would reunite actually in the 1940s. But for the remainder of the 30s, she worked with Abe Elstein, who, like Picon, was born in America, and he was trained at what later became the Juilliard School. Something of a wunderkind, Elstein was nearly 10 years younger than Picon and had begun composing for the Yiddish theater in his early 20s. He was not yet 25 when Picon and Kalish took him on an international tour after their break with Rumshinsky. Elstein would go on to write music for both of the Yiddish films in which Picon starred in the late 30s. Both were shot in Poland. The first was Yiddle Mitten Fiddle, made in 1936, in which she played a young woman who was impersonating a boy. That role served as a kind of bookend to what had been her debut years before as young Yankala. And to the extent that there is present-day scholarship on Picon, most of it is concerned with the gender identity and sexual ambiguity of those trouser role characters. Interesting as all that is, I'm pleased to say that the field is also widening now to include research into additional aspects of Picon's career. And at least one writer, Deborah Kaplan, a leading Yiddish scholar who teaches, Yiddish theater scholar, I should say, who teaches at Baruch College, has been working on a full-length biography of Picon. As for Yiddle Mitten Fiddle, despite claims to the contrary that you can find on the internet, Picon did not write any lyrics for that film. She only sang and acted in it, though I hardly mean to minimize that accomplishment. It became a signature role of hers, and Yiddle Mitten Fiddle remains the most famous of Yiddish films. But the other film she worked on with Elstein in Poland was Marshaled, made in 1938 at the 11th hour for Polish Jews. Among its musical numbers, she wrote words to both gezunt and marshaled, as the songs we heard earlier, as well as to Ich sing, it means I sing, three of Elstein's most well-known songs. Time does not permit discussion of all of them, but let's take a look at gezunt, which Picon then adapted as her, she adopted, I should say, as her professional theme song for the ensuing 40 more years of her career. I regard it as her most successful lyric.
A bissel Wind, a bissel Regen, a ruhig auf dem Kopf zu legen, a gezunt können glücklich sein. A Schich, a Sock, a Kleid und Lasses und Käschen, a 3-4 Slosses, a gezunt können glücklich sein. Die Luft ist frei, für jeden gleich. Die Wind, sie scheint für jeden, eine Wurm oder reich. A bissel Freude, a bissel Lachen, a mit Freund, a Schnäpsel machen, a gezunt können glücklich sein.
And this is the verse to the same song. That was the chorus. This is the verse.
Einer sich das Schier ist, einer sich Gewirr ist, einem in die ganze Welt. Einer meint das ganze Glück, hängt nur auf in Geld. Sollen alle siechen, sollen alle kriechen, aber ich trag von mir. Ich darf es auf Kapuris, weil das Glück steht am Tier. A bissel Sinn, a bissel Regen.
Like the rest of the song, the title is succinct, memorable, and Hamish, that is cozy, informal, in-group familiar, and above all, optimistic. Her character in the film is the mamala, that is, after her own mother died, it is she who becomes the little mama, who must take over caring for her wayward siblings and shiftless widowed father. In the first part of the film, rather than being resentful of her lot, she compensates by dismissing any need for nice clothes or, crucially, a love life for herself. The lyric to the chorus of a gezunt, the optimistic published lyric, the one that became Picon's theme song, reinforces that compensating dismissal. Let's watch a clip of the way she sings the song in the film while she bakes a challah, peels potatoes, and does the sweeping and ironing. I've taken this clip from the Polish print of the film with Polish subtitles, in large part because I like its sound. To my ear, it retains more of the high frequencies than do the prints on some DVDs that are available elsewhere. That's why, because the subtitles are in Polish, in Polish, we took a careful look at the lyrics already with the added English translation. So you would have that under your belt. Got it? So try to remember. This is the scene with a gezunt.
A bissel zin, a bissel regen, a ruhig auf dem Kopf zu legen, a wie gesinnt, kann man glücklich sein. A Schiech, a Sock, a Kleid und Laft, ist ein Käschen, a drei, viel Slots, a wie gesinnt, kann man glücklich sein. Die Luft ist frei, vor jedem gleich, die Sinn, sie scheint vor jedem, einem Urm oder Reich. Bist du frei, da bist du lach, na mu mit Freund, da Schnäpsel mach, na wie gesinnt, kann man glücklich sein. Einer sich das Schier ist, einer sich Gebier ist, einem in die ganze Welt. Einer meint, das ganze Glück hängt nur auf dem Geld. Sollen alle siechen, sollen alle kriechen, nur ich tracht an mir. Ich darf es auf Kapur ist, weil das Glück steht an Tier. Zum Regen, ruhig aus dem Kopf zu legen, wie gesinnt, kann man glücklich sein. Ich hab Sock, a Kleid und Laft, ist ein Käschen, a drei, viel Slots, das hab ich gesinnt, kann man glücklich sein. Man ist verliebt, schweigt man neueste Link. Hey, heiß, nichts zu halten, als man ist verliebt, lust man auf den Kaufen. Bei wem ihr Wasser ist doch nass, heimtücke Yinglish, sie gleiben wie ein Hint auf dem Gas. Tinkel, tinkel, wie ein Keiler, als man ist falsch, kriegt man linken Fehler. Oi, gedal, de Galle. A big gesinnt, kann man glücklich sein.
That little logo up in the corner was I got that print off the internet. Someone in Poland that was a heart, and PL is Poland. I love Poland. Someone put that on and posted on the internet, and that explains what that bug is up there. Okay, the song actually began with its chorus. It is a standard 32-bar chorus, and it is only after that the song's sole verse is heard, when Picon sits down to peel potatoes. But let's look at the words to the chorus. The song's hook resides in the arresting concision of those two words, a wie gesinnt, followed, of course, by the tagline, kann man glücklich sein. It appears as the third line following two rhyming couplets in each A section. The opening phrase, a bissel Sonne, a bissel Regen, rivals the hook for brand recognition. So memorable is it. And of course, the litany-like repetitions of a bissel in both A1 and A3 section are, if not exactly rhymed, then echoed in a B at the beginning of every third line, unifying and tying together the entire chorus. A bissel this, a bissel that, a wie gesinnt. Parenthetically, they also recall the title of a bissel Liebe, a bissel Glück, that early love song we looked at. In another way, they set up the formula in the coming verse. The music organizes this into two quatrains. The first of the two begins with its own two-part litany. Einer sich das Schieres, einer sich Gewirres. Some look for riches, some look for the might. Which the second quatrain then mimics with sollen alle sichen, sollen alle kriechen. Let them search, let them crawl about. Time doesn't permit a close reading like we did with a bissel Liebe, a bissel Glück. But I want to draw your attention to something that happens in the film. When the chorus returns after the verse, she sings it only halfway through. At the bridge, in which she had earlier sung Die Luft ist frei für jeden gleich, the air is free for all alike, it is now the instruments on the soundtrack that continue alone without Picon's character, while Picon's character does a short ballet tossing peeled potatoes into a boiling pot. And then she skips over to the ironing board as the melody of the chorus comes to a close. Notice that as she begins ironing, the music modulates up a whole step rather. My cursor is not showing up. Here we go. Did you hear that? It moved up a whole step. I'll play it again. Musically, it's merely a way of extending the form, but dramatically, it's a portentous signal. And she begins to once again sing the melody of the chorus. But the stakes are higher now. Well, yes, they're higher. So they modulated up a whole step. But they're higher because the words have changed, and radically so. Here they are.
Man ist verliebt, schweigt man neueste Link. Ei, heiß ist heiß, nix zu halten, als man ist verliebt, bloß man auf den Kaufen. Oi, weh mir Wasser ist doch nass, heimtike Yinglish, sie gleiten wie ein Hint auf den Gas. Tinkel, tinkel, wie ein Keiler, als man ist falsch, kriegt man linken Fehler. Oi, gedal, de galle. A big gezunt kennen glücklich sein.
Those are some words, huh? In the film, in each A section, in which there is a tautological repetition such as glass is glass, it's accompanied by a kind of material realization of her doggerel. First, she clinks the glass of water that's on the ironing board as she sings "Gloss is gloss" when as Gita kling, glass is glass, and it rings, or clinking it will make it ring. Listen carefully. Did you hear that happen? So it begins with gluz is gluz. Then she burns herself on the iron and says, "Haste is haste, hot is hot." For the bridge of this chorus, she sings, "Oy vey mir Wasser is doch nass." Oy vey, water is wet, as she dampens the clothes on the ironing board. Oy vey mir Wasser is doch nass, heimtike Yinglish. And for the conclusion, she sings, "Tinkle, tinkle, via Kaler, dark, dark, like a cellar, the darkness of which is only realized when we see the blackened challah pulled from the oven." Tinkle, tinkle, via Kaler, als man is fout, kriegt man linken Fehler. Oi, gedal, de challah. A big gezunt kennen glücklich sein. So each A section is grounded in some reality, but then each one truly goes off the rails, growing progressively darker until she is singing about tuberculosis. It is a mistake to think of this sequence as being akin to a new verse, for it is not a verse at all. There was, in fact, only one verse to this song, sandwiched between iterations of the chorus. Rather, this is a revision of the chorus that has modulated up a step. And this time, she never sings the hook. That is, she remains silent each time the line with a gezunt comes around, while it is the instruments that continue to play its melody. During A3 of this revision, doubt crosses her face and she remembers that she has put a challah in the oven at the start of the number. She stops singing, and in silence, the instruments have also stopped. She runs to the oven and pulls out the burnt challah. Now, finally, she sings the hook, but sobbing as she does so. Abi gezunt ken men glücklich sein. These revised lyrics are both funny and a little nonsensical, the way each couplet begins with a tautological repetition, such as glass is glass. In their frivolous sing-song way, they're a little bit like beginning with roses are red, violets are blue. And just as in that greeting card Valentine, these self-evident openings turn to the matter of love each time. The second line of each A section begins, As men is verliebt, when you're in love. But also, just as roses are red can so often do, think of a 7-year-old boy's triumphant self-satisfaction at ending, roses are red, violets are blue, onions stink, and so do you. Just as roses are red can do that, the words here turn cynical and more. They are acidly sarcastic and even morbidly so. I am entirely in debt to the wonderful Yiddishist and writer Michael Wex for kindly pointing out to me that the references to glass and to lungs in A1, for example, anticipate the bombshell about Lungenfehler, tuberculosis, in A3. Here's how Michael explained the lyric. Love is like TB, he wrote me. It kills you little by little, the way you spit your lungs up with consumption. The glass image here is meant to invoke the silicosis so widespread among glass workers. You paid for the beautiful ringing sound by literally coughing your lungs up. So, love is introduced at the beginning of each second line in each A section by reiterating the phrase, when you're in love. In A2, that line is completed with blost men afkalten, which has the literal meaning that one blows on something that is cold. But the idiom means, as Michael again explained to me, that you become overly careful. You blow on an ice cream soda as you would on a bowl of hot soup. In my translation here, it's saying I use overcompensate, and that may be a totally wooden rendering. But the point is that Picon's character has begun to experience doubts about her self-sufficiency. Though she may not be ready to admit them yet, this revised chorus in Abi gezunt announces the doubts that have awakened in Picon's character, not merely about her self-sufficiency, but in particular about her dismissal of her need for love. During the film's opening, Abi gezunt actually closes this first act with the film going to black. But earlier, she'd had interaction with her neighbor, a tall, dark, and handsome violinist, right? Their love will of course bloom over the course of the film. And that change has already taken root, which we, the viewers, knew, of course, before Picon's character actually did. The exaggerated shunning of love in this revised chorus suggests her denial. Methinks the lady doth protest too much, in other words. Though she looks happy as she is singing, the fact is, at this point, she cannot bear even to utter the words Abi gezunt. She leaves that to the orchestra to fill in. But finally, she does sing them, sobbing. And though her unhappiness is supposedly attributable to the burnt challah, in the context of the narrative arc, her desperation is more convincingly attributable to her growing recognition that Abi gezunt, which had become a kind of manifesto of self-sufficiency for her, is after all not enough. Or perhaps we might say, because the complexity of a work of art allows for multiple levels on which an action can be operating, we truly do experience her crying over the burnt challah. But we can simultaneously understand that there is a deeper dramatic meaning to her tears. In that sense, the lyrics in this revised chorus, more than anywhere else, go beyond, for example, mere characterization, which was the function of Abi gezunt's original words that painted a picture of a character who accepted her lot in life. And they go beyond reflecting on some event that had occurred or on an emotional state that viewers develop. Picon's lyrics to the revised chorus inform viewers in real time of a material change underway in the narrative. As such, they are even more integrated into the dramaturgy and the mechanics of the storytelling than those of any other song in the film. It is the kind of thing you might expect of a lyric by Stephen Sondheim. It is the kind of thing that only a masterful lyricist could conceive of and then write. Thank you. That was it. Okay, for those of you wanting to follow up on Picon, she did write 2 engaging memoirs. Molly, written after Kalish died and before she turned 90, is an autobiography. So Laugh a Little, which purports to be a memoir about her grandmother, but is filled with details about Picon's health, was written early. She turned 60. As for her songs, the most accessible source is the New York Times Great Songs of the Yiddish Theater, edited by Norman Wormwood and with an introduction by Molly. It has quite a few songs with her lyrics, all newly transliterated, but they are not translated. It was published in the 1970s and I believe is now out of print, but it's easy to find used copies. For translations of her lyrics, many will appear in a study of mine, soon to appear in a volume entitled Women on the Yiddish Stage, edited by Elisa Quint and Amanda Siegel. Elisa is a Yiddish theater scholar and an editor at Tablet Magazine, and she currently teaches at Yeshiva University. And Amanda, or Miriam Chaya, as she is known to her friends and in the Yiddish world, is a singer and Yiddish culture activist. And in her other life, she's a skilled librarian. The volume is currently in press at Legenda, an imprint in the UK-based Modern Humanities Research Association. And I would assume it will be actually appearing later this year. I understand it's being typeset now. Legenda titles are available internationally, including in the United States. So, to listen to Picon's songs, besides YouTube, there are 2 easily accessible sites for streaming old recordings of Yiddish songs. One is the Mayrent collection of Yiddish recordings at the University of Wisconsin. The other is the Judaic collection of the recorded sound archives at Florida Atlantic University. The prodigious Mayrent collection, donated by musician and passionate collector Sherry Mayrent, let's go back there for you, has far superior search capabilities, but is limited to 78s and also to cylinder recordings, which are even older. The Florida site is less scholarly, with a lot of information put together by non-experts. But besides 78s, it includes collections on vinyl LP reissues, cassette tapes, and more. Often what one cannot find on one of those sites shows up on the other. So happy listening. It was Carnegie Hall that approached the YIVO Institute with the idea of partnering in some presentations about women in music. Before that, though, came the Women on the Yiddish Stage volume, whose editors I want to thank for having invited me to undertake my original study, a study which could not have happened without Stephanie Halpern, director of the YIVO archives, and Lauren Sklamberg, YIVO's sound archivist, both of whom facilitated my access to so much information. Sherry Mayrent, always with good cheer, also graciously made numerous indispensable old recordings available to me. And we would not be here now had composer Alex Weiser, who is YIVO's public programs director, not invited me to turn that original study into a lecture. Lastly, but hardly least, my thanks go to you, the listeners out there in cyberspace for whom this was written. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. What a wonderful talk. And I see tons of really delighted people in the chat thanking you from all around of our viewers. This was really terrific. And I'm sure that people will be very excited to follow up in the links that we've shared for further reading and further listening, and to see the full study when it comes out. So congratulations and thank you so much. We have a few moments here for some questions. So let's just dive in. One of the things that you brought up, Ron, that you said we don't have time for, maybe we can unpack it for just a few minutes here. Is this question, what is Jewish music? And you know, just to go back to that song, Es fällt dir die Rosinke, one of our viewers named Olga pointed out in the chat that there's a saying in Russian, she lacks izhuminka, she lacks the small raisin. That's actually a Russian, which, and then in Russian, that means it's something along the lines of this Yiddish phrase, she lacks individuality or charisma, is how Olga put it. But I know you've done a lot of work on the relationship between, you know, these Yiddish songs in the kind of Yiddish theater context to the kind of contemporaneous English language popular music. And you kind of alluded to that a little bit, but maybe you could unpack that relationship a little bit for us, you know, auf ein Fuß, as they say, and what's Jewish, what's not Jewish, how is this music happening in the Yiddish theater related to, you know, English language music of the same milieu?
Well, I can't be in the side of the head of listeners, you know, in 1895 or 1915 or whatever. But one thing initially that made it seem Jewish to them, perhaps, was simply the old worldness of it. For those who were in America, we won't begin to get into what Yiddish theater music was in Europe at that time, because we're talking about theater music in America here. But I presume that just the fact that it seemed to be from the old world in some sense, just even if it's just based on Viennese operetta, that gave it a sense of the old world that they could relate to. But more importantly, and especially later, ironically later, in the earliest Yiddish theater music at the close of the 19th century and in the first decade of the 20th, it was very much European. But then composers began, especially with Rimshinsky, but then the next generation with Elstein and Sholem Sekunda and Alexander Olshanetsky, they began actively exploring modal scales with modes that were used in Jewish prayer, Ashkenazic Jewish prayer, and in folk music, and especially in klezmer music. And you can even hear that in Es fällt dir die Rosinke. Da-dee, da-dee. I'm not going to try to sing.
It's okay. No need to sing.
I'm not going to do it. I'm stage. I'm freezing. I'm freezing like Boris Tomaszewski did when he tried to do an English show on Broadway, and he got out on stage and froze, and the show collapsed. It just collapsed. It closed. Anyway, they use these modes with augmented intervals, and the poster child for which would be Hava Nagila, with the Hava Rabbah mode, that and other modes that they would insert in phrases that became signifiers for ethnic content, and it was the later generation of composers that began actively exploiting that, and actively exploiting and exploring what kinds of harmonies could apply to the modes and how they could use them for multiple meanings, so that they could code switch back and forth. So Es fällt dir die Rosinke, the first phrase in the chorus is in a minor key, and the second one is in a mode, the altered Dorian mode, or Mishaberach mode, and that gave it a sense of being Jewish. And I lost track of what your question was.
That was it. You've answered. It was great. And I'll just let viewers know that Ron's study of Elstein's music has some really interesting things to say about some of these same questions, and I highly recommend that as well. Can
I add something
absolutely,
else about?
Absolutely.
So that was what made it sound Jewish. What made it sound American? And we can use a particular instance. Rumshinsky wrote a show, and this was right on the cusp of his emergence as an important composer. But Bessie Tomaszewski, who was estranged from her husband Boris Tomaszewski, hired Rumshinsky to write the music for a show called Hancha in America, which was one of her very favorite shows and was incredibly dear. When I was working on the Tomaszewski project for Michael Tilson Thomas, this was the the centerpiece of, I think, of his memory of his grandmother, and she was a smash hit in it, and she reinvented her career and all sorts of stuff. But what I want to draw your attention to, there's a theater historian by the name of Zalman Zilbertzweig, who's written this enormous reference work about the Yiddish theater, the Encyclopedia of Yiddish Theater. He commented that show was the first time that American rhythm appeared in Yiddish song. Whether that was literally exactly true or not is kind of beside the point. But it speaks to what was happening and what was being assimilated into the Yiddish stage from the 19-teens into the 20s and 30s. And by the 30s, it wasn't a stretch for By Mir Bist Du Schön to be adapted into a swing song. It seemed like an organic progression in American culture, so in American Jewish culture.
You spoke a little bit about Molly Picon's kind of rise to fame and how she became even an impresario, not just a singer, an actor, and a writer. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how she developed as a lyricist over the course of her career, and if there's any insight about that, about how, because you talked about early lyrics and also later lyrics, is there anything to say about how she developed? And also, one of our viewers along those lines is curious if we know anything about her inspiration for some of these really vivid imagery that she uses in these songs.
Well, in the study that I did for Women on the Yiddish Stage, I treat the work chronologically, so readers can actually infer for themselves as they read how she developed as a lyricist. For this lecture, I didn't want to start with that very close reading of a bissaleh and a bissaleh, because it seemed I didn't want this compositionally. I wanted that to be the slow movement in the middle, So I shuffled chronology around, so that may have been confusing. But her development as a lyricist parallels what we were talking about in music, which is that in her earliest songs, she began inserting a few English words. And by the time she got to novelty songs like Busy, Busy, she began inserting a few Yiddish words in the English instead of a few English words into the Yiddish. So she was the whole time trying to break into mainstream American entertainment. So she was working in English on vaudeville. She tried to do that. By the 30s, she was doing that actively. She made many attempts to break into Hollywood, and almost to a one they failed. There are a very small number of shorts that Warner Brothers tried making with her, which can be found. They're on DVDs and they're around now. But she did not become a headliner in films certainly before World War II. Finally, in 1940, she got a role in English on Broadway, a starring role in the play Morning Star, which by Sylvia Regan, who became Elstein married. Elstein married the playwright. Actually, he got hired to write a couple of songs on the show, and he ended up marrying the playwright. So she was always working in transition, and she finally then spent the second half of her career in English with a Yiddish accent. She was typecast. She was almost always playing, a Jewish woman. She wasn't just an actress in Yiddish. She actually spoke with no accent. I mean, she was not, and she did not speak an accented English. She grew up in this country, but professionally, she was forced to most of the time, not all the time. When you listen to old radio shows she was on, she spoke naturally. Her writing, I think, in the 30s also, as she became the hostess of the hostess. That's a terrible word. She hosted the Maxwell House something coffee hours, a half hour something radio show she had, and she wrote hundreds of scripts, I believe. I'm not sure how many. There are more than 100 extant in her papers at the American Jewish Historical Society. I mean, she was a writer. She must have spent hours and hours, writing constantly when she wasn't on stage. I don't know what she read. I don't know how she went about finding her imagery. I don't know this, but she hung out with interesting people, and was working all the time. So there was a lot of it was fertile ground.
I see a quick question in the chat about where Molly's manuscripts are. We do have a Molly Picon collection at YIVO. There's also part of her collection at the American Jewish Historical Society, if I'm correct. Is that right, Ron?
That's correct. The YIVO collection is actually smaller. The American Jewish Historical Society collection, which is housed, which is also at the Center for Jewish History, has her large correspondence. That's the other thing she wrote. She corresponded a lot. And she and Kalish, when they were apart, wrote to each other every day. It was like texting. I mean, and all these letters are saved. It's amazing how much she wrote.
Wonderful.
Also, her sheet music, her own sheet music collection, also her own collection of play scripts, which is incredibly interesting and valuable.
And actually comes up in our lecture for next week about women in opera. I know Samantha Madison Cooper has worked on this. Talks about a little bit about some of the opera libretti that she has in her collection, which is just amazing, and the things that are marked up. But just to add to that, we have a lot of other Molly Picon material in other collections at YIVO. So there's lots of interesting material to access. Perhaps one last question. So we heard Molly herself sing today, but other people sang these songs too. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that. Oh yeah, well, these songs and other songs that she wrote, just to be clear.
Yeah. Lots can be found, in those resources that I mentioned. Seymour Rechtszeit sang numbers of her songs. I mean, he worked very closely with Elstein. They made many recordings, and he was marvelous because he had he had a beautiful voice and technically his instrument was, he had tremendous control over it, and as free and as much rubato as he would use, and as free as he was, and seemingly as relaxed as he was as a singer, he had such unbelievably spot on rhythmic control. So when you listen, he could code shift back and forth between American rhythm and operetta rhythms, and they're really beautiful. His recording of Ich Sing that she wrote lyrics to. I'm trying to think of any others in particular. but Mazel has been sung by everybody. I mean, that was Adrian Cooper, Ole Sholem, that whose recording I played, that she did so beautifully. But many people have not just do Mazel now, you know.
Absolutely. Well, Ron, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for this. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Alex, so much for your support in this project. Very much appreciate it. So, thank you.